There's something eerie about being on a boat alone in the middle of a lake, especially at night. I was used to it by now, though, having spent the better part of the last 10 years fishing these waters. But that night was different. The air was still and thick with mist, and the moon was hidden behind a blanket of clouds. The familiar sounds of the lake, croaking frogs, chirping crickets, were absent, leaving behind an unsettling silence. I leaned back in my chair, letting the gentle sway of the boat lull me. It was a ritual of mine, coming out here after a long day, drifting aimlessly until the stars came out. I felt at peace on the water, like it was the one place I could escape the chaos of the world. But that night, peace felt distant, replaced by a creeping unease that I couldn't quite shake. I cast my line into the water, watching as the ripples slowly disappeared into the dark. There was something hypnotic about it, the way the water consumed everything, as though it could swallow me whole if I let it. I found myself staring into the lake, my reflection dim and distorted in the stillness. Then something moved, a slight ripple where there shouldn't have been one. I stood up, squinting through the mist, trying to make sense of it. First, I thought it was a fish, but no, it was too large for that, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the water. Nothing, just the endless black surface, stretching out into the void. I exhaled, telling myself it was just my imagination. I sat back down, gripping my fishing rod a little tighter than before. Then I heard it, a soft splash, followed by a faint but unmistakable whisper. It was so quiet, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I scanned the water again, but there was nothing, only silence. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the wind, but there was no wind. The air was dead. And then the whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice. Come closer. The words were faint, as though spoken from deep beneath the surface. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The lake was playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself. But the voice came again, more insistent this time. Come closer. I looked around, my pulse quickening. The mist was thickening, closing in on the boat. My instincts told me to leave, to get the hell out of there. But something else, a curiosity, a pull, kept me anchored in place. The water rippled again, and for a brief moment, I saw it. Something pale moving just below the surface. A hand, slender and skeletal, reaching up toward me. I staggered back, almost tripping over my chair. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it at the spot where the hand had been. But once again, there was nothing. The water was still, too still. I grabbed the oars, ready to row back to shore, but my hands were trembling. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I couldn't understand what was happening. This lake, it had always been my sanctuary, my escape. But now, it felt like it was turning on me, pulling me into something dark and unknowable. I dipped the oars into the water, but before I could start rowing, the boat lurched. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but then it happened again, stronger this time, like something beneath the boat had nudged it. My heart raced. I leaned over the edge, trying to see what was beneath me, but the water was too dark. Come closer, the voice whispered again, clearer now, almost seductive. I sat back, gripping the sides of the boat. Who's there? I called out, my voice echoing across the empty lake. No answer, only silence. Then, with a violent jerk, the boat tipped, throwing me off balance. I scrambled to grab the side, but before I could steady myself, something cold and wet wrapped around my ankle. I screamed, kicking frantically as I tried to pull free, but the grip tightened, pulling me toward the edge. I clung to the boat, my fingers digging into the wood as I fought to stay above water. I looked down, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, pale, bloated hands, their fingers long and bony, clawing at my leg, dragging me toward the water. I kicked harder, but it was no use. The grip was unrelenting. The boat rocked violently as I thrashed, my body slipping closer and closer to the edge. My head swam with panic, and in my desperation, I reached for the flashlight, swinging it blindly at the hands. The beam caught something pale and lifeless, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. I screamed again, my voice hoarse and raw. The thing beneath me let out a low, guttural sound, a sound that chilled me to my core. It wasn't just pulling me down. It wanted me. It wanted to drag me into the depths, to make me a part of whatever nightmare lurked beneath the surface. With one final burst of strength, I kicked free, pulling myself back into the boat. I collapsed onto the floor, panting, my body trembling uncontrollably. The boat rocked gently, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the oars with shaking hands. I didn't care where I rowed, as long as it was away from there. The mist closed in around me, swallowing the boat as I rowed blindly, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispers followed me, faint, almost mocking. Come closer. I rowed faster, my muscles burning, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to escape. The lake stretched on endlessly, the mist thickening until I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I was lost, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake from. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The mist began to thin, and in the distance I saw it, the shoreline. Relief washed over me, and I rowed harder, the boat cutting through the water like a lifeline. But just as I neared the shore, I heard it again. A whisper so faint I almost missed it. I'm waiting. I looked back, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the dark, still water, stretching out into the night. I rowed to shore, my hands trembling as I pulled the boat onto the sand. My legs felt weak, barely able to support me as I staggered onto solid ground. I looked back at the lake one last time, half expecting to see something. Someone, watching me from the water. But there was nothing, only the silence. I told myself it was over, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I had barely slept since that night on the lake. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a threat. My mind kept replaying the events. The whispers, the icy grip pulling me toward the water. It was all too real, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise. Even now, as I sat in my small cabin overlooking the lake, the memory of those pale, grasping hands gnawed at me. The cabin had always been a retreat, a place to get away from everything. I'd inherited it from my father, a gruff man who had spent more time on the water than on land. I wondered if he'd ever encountered the same thing I had. He'd always spoken of the lake with a certain respect, as if it were alive, watching, waiting. I glanced out the window. The mist hung low over the water, just like that night. It was thick, almost oppressive, and it refused to lift. I hadn't been back on the lake since, and yet, every night I could hear the faintest of whispers drifting through the trees, carried on the still air. Come closer. I hadn't told anyone about what happened. I doubted anyone would believe me anyway. Who would? Sounded insane even to me. A ghostly voice calling from the water? Pale hands dragging me to some watery grave? It sounded like something out of a bad horror novel. But the bruises on my ankle, the scratches along the side of the boat, and the nightmares that haunted me every time I closed my eyes, those were all too real. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to shake off the exhaustion. I needed sleep, but every time I lay down, I could hear it. That whisper. It had become part of my nights now, a constant companion. It started faint, barely audible, but each night it grew louder, closer. I had tried ignoring it. I had tried leaving the radio on, drowning the sound with music, but nothing worked. The whisper cut through everything, seeping into my thoughts like a slow, creeping poison. I was starting to feel like I was going mad. The worst part was that it wasn't just at night anymore. During the day, I would catch glimpses of something moving in the water, something pale and serpentine, slithering just beneath the surface. At first, I told myself it was just fish or maybe a trick of the light. But it wasn't. I knew that now. The lake wanted me back. Whatever I had encountered that night wasn't finished with me. The thought sent a chill down my spine, colder than the autumn breeze that rattled the windows. It was around noon when I decided to confront the thing, whatever it was. I couldn't live like this, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to drag me back into that black water. I needed answers. I packed my things, a flashlight, a knife, some rope, and a flask of whiskey for courage, and headed out. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, the scent of autumn in full swing. The lake stretched out before me, vast and silent, its dark waters beckoning. As I walked down to the dock, the fog seemed to part slightly, allowing me a clearer view of the water's surface. It looked peaceful, undisturbed, but I knew better. There was something lurking beneath, something that had waited long enough. I stepped into the boat, the wood creaking under my weight. The moment I sat down, the air seemed to change. It was subtle, but I felt it. The way the wind seemed to still, how the birds that had been chirping went silent. I rowed slowly, each stroke of the oars cutting through the water with a quiet splash. The mist curled around the boat, closing in like a shroud. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was my lake. I had fished these waters for years. I wouldn't let some twisted nightmare scare me off. As I moved further from shore, the whispers started again, soft at first, like a faint echo on the wind. Come closer. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed on the water. The voice was clearer now, almost melodic, like it was beckoning me, inviting me to join it. I stopped rowing, letting the boat drift. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional lap of water against the hull. I reached into my bag, pulling out the flashlight, my hand trembling as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the fog, casting long shadows on the surface of the water. For a moment, everything was still. Then the water rippled. It started small, a gentle wave spreading from the center of the lake, but it quickly grew, the ripples turning into small waves, rocking the boat from side to side. I stood, gripping the edge, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow moving just beneath the surface. But as it grew closer, the details became clearer. It was a shape, a human shape, pale and twisted, like something that had been submerged for too long. Its eyes were dark hollows, its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin. I stumbled back, almost falling out of the boat. The figure rose slowly from the water, its long, bony fingers reaching out toward me. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice now unmistakably real, the sound filling the air like a chorus of the dead. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs were frozen, my mind paralyzed with terror. The thing's hand broke the surface of the water, dripping with slime, reaching for the edge of the boat. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed the oars and rowed, hard. The boat jerked forward, but the thing followed, sliding through the water with unnatural speed. Its voice grew louder, more insistent. Closer. I rowed faster, my muscles burning, but no matter how hard I pushed, the thing was right behind me. I could feel its presence, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I wasn't going to make it. The boat rocked violently as something struck the side. I lost my grip on the oars and they slipped into the water, disappearing into the dark depths. I was helpless now, at the mercy of whatever nightmare had crawled up from the lake's depths. The boat lurched again, and I fell, my head slamming against the wood. My vision blurred as I lay there, dazed, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. And then, in the fog, I saw her. A woman, no, a creature, floating just above the water's surface. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her hair dark and flowing like seaweed. Her eyes were hollow, lifeless, and her lips curled into a smile that chilled me to my core. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice soft, but filled with malice. I tried to crawl away, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear, as she reached out, her long, thin fingers wrapping around my wrist. Her touch was ice, colder than anything I had ever felt. I could feel the life draining from me, the warmth of my body being sucked into her cold, dead hands. She pulled, and I slid toward the edge of the boat, closer to the water, closer to her waiting arms. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was her face, twisted into that same cruel smile, as she dragged me down into the depths. I don't remember the moment I hit the water. All I remember is the cold. It wasn't just the icy bite of lake water in the middle of autumn. This was different. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, numbing your body and locking your mind in a silent scream. My limbs felt like lead as the water swallowed me whole. The darkness under the lake was suffocating. I tried to kick, to swim, but I couldn't move. I was being pulled deeper, dragged down by unseen hands, the water pressing against me from every direction. Above, the faint outline of the boat disappeared as I sank further into the abyss. I could barely make out the pale face of the thing that had grabbed me, her mouth open in a terrible grin, watching me with hollow eyes as I descended into the depths. I struggled against her pull, but it was useless. My lungs burned as I fought the instinct to inhale, to scream, but the water kept pressing in, cold and merciless. I was drowning, sinking into a darkness that felt eternal. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pulling stopped. The grip around my wrist loosened, and I was left floating, suspended in the pitch-black water. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached out blindly, but there was nothing. No boat, no surface, just the crushing weight of the lake around me. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. A soft voice, barely more than a whisper, echoing through the water. Closer! I spun in the water, trying to find the source of the voice, but all I could see was black. The cold was making my mind sluggish, my body unresponsive. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the presence. Something was here with me, watching, waiting. The whisper came again, closer this time. Come closer. I kicked my legs, pushing myself through the water, desperate to escape, but it felt like I was moving through molasses. My limbs were heavy, my movements slow and uncoordinated. And still, the voice called to me, closer. Suddenly, something brushed against my leg. I jerked back, my pulse skyrocketing. My flashlight was long gone, swallowed by the depths, and I was completely blind, helpless in the dark. I thrashed wildly, trying to swim away from whatever was down there with me, but the cold had drained my strength. I felt it again, this time against my arm, something smooth and slimy, like the touch of wet skin. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. The thing was circling me, brushing against me in the dark, its presence palpable in the water. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the black water, watching me. They were large, too large, and they glowed with an unnatural light, like some deep-sea creature that had no business being in a freshwater lake. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared back, frozen with fear. The eyes blinked once, slowly, and then the thing moved. It rushed toward me with terrifying speed, and before I could react, it was upon me. I felt the cold, slimy skin against my own as it wrapped itself around me, coiling like a serpent. Its grip was unrelenting, tightening around my chest and legs, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I thrashed wildly, trying to break free, but it was like fighting a nightmare. No matter how hard I struggled, the thing held me in place, dragging me deeper into the darkness. The voice came again, this time inside my head, echoing through my thoughts with a terrifying clarity. Come closer. My vision was starting to blur, spots of light dancing in the blackness as I struggled to hold onto consciousness. Couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was going to cave in under the pressure of the water and the thing wrapped around me. I could feel it tightening, squeezing the life out of me. And then, just as I thought I was about to black out, the thing released me. I floated there, stunned, gasping for air that wasn't there. I kicked weakly, trying to swim toward what I thought was the surface, but my body was too weak, too cold. I was sinking again, slowly, my movements sluggish and uncoordinated. But something was different now. I looked down, and through the murky water, I saw it. The bottom of the lake. It was closer than I had thought, just a few feet below me. And there, resting on the lake bed, was something that shouldn't have been there. A house. It was an old, crumbling structure, half buried in the silt and mud. The roof had collapsed in places, and the windows were broken, dark holes that seemed to stare back at me. There was something deeply wrong about the house, something that made my skin crawl just looking at it. But what really caught my eye was the figure standing at the doorway. It was the woman, the thing that had pulled me into the water. She stood there, her pale face glowing faintly in the dark, her long hair floating around her like tendrils of seaweed. Her hollow eyes were fixed on me, and she smiled. A cold, cruel smile that chilled me to my core. She lifted her hand, beckoning. Come closer. I tried to swim away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was drifting toward her, pulled by some unseen force. My mind screamed at me to fight, to get away, but it was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The closer I got to the house, the more I could feel it, the cold, oppressive weight pressing down on me. It wasn't just the water. It was something else, something darker. The house seemed to pulse with it, a deep, rhythmic thrum that I could feel in my bones. It was ancient, older than the lake itself, and it wanted me. I was almost at the door now, my body drifting toward the waiting figure. Her smile widened as I got closer, her arms outstretched, ready to pull me into the blackness beyond. I felt a wave of terror surge through me, stronger than anything I had ever felt before. I couldn't let her take me. I couldn't go into that house. With a burst of adrenaline, I kicked out, propelling myself away from the door. My muscles screamed in protest, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I had to get out of the water. The woman's smile faltered as she reached for me, her fingers brushing against my skin. But I was faster, just barely. I pushed off the lake bed, kicking with every ounce of strength I had left. The surface felt impossibly far away, but I didn't stop. I swam harder than I ever had in my life, the cold biting at my skin, the pressure building in my chest. I could feel her behind me, reaching, her fingers brushing against my leg. I didn't look back, couldn't. My vision was narrowing, darkening around the edges. My lungs were on fire, and my limbs felt like they were made of stone. But then, through the darkness, I saw it, the faint glow of the surface. With one final push, I broke through. I gasped for air, choking and sputtering as I dragged myself onto the boat. My body was trembling uncontrollably, my muscles screaming in pain. But I was alive. Somehow I had made it out. I collapsed onto the deck, staring up at the sky. The clouds had parted, revealing the pale glow of the moon. The mist had lifted, and the lake was calm once again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I rolled onto my side, my body aching, and looked out at the water. It was still deceptively peaceful, but beneath the surface, I knew she was still there, waiting, and she wouldn't stop, not until she pulled me back down into the depths. The days after I surfaced from that nightmare passed in a fog. I was exhausted but couldn't sleep. The images of that pale woman, the house beneath the lake, and those horrible, hollow eyes haunted my every thought. I tried to stay away from the water, but the lake was always there, a vast and dark presence looming outside my cabin window. Every time I glanced at it, I could feel her down there, waiting. I became a prisoner of my own fear, barricading myself inside, as if the walls of the cabin could keep her out. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. It was only a matter of time before she came for me again. The whispers started to come during the day now. Faint, at first, almost like a breeze slipping through the cracks of the window. But they grew louder, more insistent, the same words repeating over and over in my mind. Come closer. You can't escape. I tried to block them out, drowning the sounds with the noise of the television. But it didn't work. The whispers cut through everything, filling my mind until I could barely think. I found myself standing at the window more and more, staring at the lake as if it were calling me, pulling me closer with each passing moment. I had to leave. I knew that. The cabin, the lake. It was all tied to her, and if I stayed any longer, she would drag me down again. This time, I wouldn't be able to fight her off. I was certain of it. But leaving wasn't as simple as it seemed. Every time I packed a bag or reached for my keys, something stopped me. A pressure, almost like an invisible hand pressing down on my chest, holding me in place. The thought of driving away filled me with a bone-deep dread, as if leaving the lake would only make things worse. There was no running from this. I knew that now. The lake had me, and she wouldn't let go. The final night came without warning. I had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from days of restless anxiety. My dreams were plagued with half-formed images: dark water, the pale face of the woman, and the cold, suffocating pressure of being pulled into the depths. When I woke, it was to complete and utter silence. The kind of silence that presses in on your ears, like the whole world is holding its breath. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the pale moon filtering through the window. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Something felt wrong. And then I heard it, the sound of water dripping. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The dripping sound was soft, rhythmic, like water falling from a great height. It was coming from inside the cabin. I slowly turned my head toward the source, my stomach knotting with fear. The door leading to the porch was ajar, just slightly, and in the dim moonlight I saw it. A small puddle of water forming at the base of the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I stood up, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor, my mind caught in a whirlwind of panic. The air was thick with the smell of dampness, that same earthy scent I had noticed when I had first been pulled into the lake. The door creaked, slowly opening wider, and then I saw her. She stood just beyond the threshold, her wet, pale body glowing in the moonlight. Her hair clung to her face, dripping water onto the wooden floorboards, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. Her mouth was stretched into that same awful smile, the one that twisted her features into something inhuman. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice low and hollow, echoing through the cabin. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't be here. She was supposed to be in the water, beneath the lake, not in my home. But she was. She took a step forward, water pooling around her feet as she moved closer, her thin, bony hands reaching out toward me. I could hear the water dripping from her fingers, each drop hitting the floor with a soft, echoing splash. "Come closer." I turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway toward the back door. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest tightening with fear. I had to get out. I had to escape. I reached the back door and yanked it open, stumbling outside into the cold night air. The mist had returned, thick and suffocating, swallowing the cabin in a pale haze. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, but I didn't care. I kept running, my feet pounding against the ground as I fled into the woods. The whispers followed me. Closer. I could hear her behind me, the wet, slapping sound of her feet on the ground, the steady drip of water as she moved. I didn't dare look back. I knew she was there, just behind me, gaining with every step. The trees blurred past me as I ran, branches whipping at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going, pushing myself forward, deeper into the woods. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers stayed with me. Closer. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity, my body on the verge of collapse. But finally, I broke through the trees and found myself standing on the edge of the lake. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The lake was calm, perfectly still, the surface like a black mirror reflecting the pale light of the moon. The mist hung low over the water, swirling in the night air, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard her again. "Come closer." I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. She stood at the tree line, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark, her wet hair hanging in limp strands around her face. Her smile was wider now, stretching unnaturally across her face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. And she was still moving closer. I backed up, my foot slipping on the wet ground. The cold water of the lake lapped at my heels, and I realized, too late, that I was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The lake behind me, the woman in front of me. She had me cornered. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Leave me alone." Her smile faltered for a brief moment, her hollow eyes narrowing. Then she took another step forward, her hand outstretched. "Come closer." I had no choice. I turned and plunged into the lake, the cold water closing over my head as I swam. My muscles screamed in protest, the freezing water biting at my skin, but I didn't stop. I had to get away, but the water didn't feel like water anymore. It felt thick, heavy, pulling me down with every stroke. My limbs were numb, my movements sluggish. The lake wasn't just pulling me under, it was dragging me back to her. I kicked harder, gasping for breath as I broke the surface. The shore was gone, the trees swallowed by the mist. I was alone, floating in the middle of the lake, surrounded by nothing but darkness. And then, from the depths below, I felt it. A hand, cold, bony fingers wrapped around my ankle, pulling me down. I screamed, thrashing wildly, but it was no use. The hand tightened its grip, dragging me deeper into the black water. The surface disappeared above me, replaced by the dark, crushing weight of the lake. She was pulling me back to the house. I could see it now, rising out of the darkness below me, the crumbling structure waiting to swallow me whole. The pale woman stood in the doorway, her smile wide and hungry. I fought harder, my lungs burning as I kicked against the grip of the lake. But it was too strong. The cold seeped into my bones, and I could feel myself slipping away, the darkness closing in around me. "Closer," her voice whispered, echoing through the water. And then, as I was pulled into the depths, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. Hours? Days? When I woke, I was lying on the shore, the cold water lapping at my feet. The mist had lifted, the sun breaking through the clouds in weak, pale rays. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my mind a blur. The lake stretched out before me, calm and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. She was still down there, waiting, and one day she would come for me again.